In January 1888, the stagecoach robber known as Black Bart walked out of San Quentin prison and promised reporters that he was finished with crime. A few weeks later, he vanished. Wells Fargo detectives followed the trail as far as they could, but the man who had spent years leaving poems behind at robberies suddenly left almost nothing behind at all. This is not another story about Billy the Kid or Jesse James, because their endings are already famous. This is about the outlaws who reached the edge of the historical record and then seemed to step off it. Some escaped jail. Some crossed borders. Some were reported dead without a body that could be confidently identified, and in several cases, the rumors that came afterward became harder to kill than the outlaw himself. Black Bart had built one of the strangest criminal reputations in the American West. His real name was Charles Bowles, and he robbed stagecoaches in California while presenting himself less like a drunken desperado than a careful professional. He was known for politeness, for avoiding profanity, and for the poems associated with some of his robberies. That image helped turn him into a legend, but it was a small piece of laundry that helped destroy his anonymity. After a failed robbery in 1883, investigators connected evidence from the scene to a San Francisco laundry mark. The trail eventually led to Bowles. He pleaded guilty and was sent to San Quentin. Prison records describe a man who behaved well and learned useful work while serving his sentence. When he was released in January 1888, reporters were waiting. Bowles said he was done robbing stagecoaches. He also wrote to his wife that he was tired of being watched and wanted to get away from everyone. Then the record begins to dissolve. By late February, a man believed to be Bowles was traced to Visalia, California. After that, the confirmed trail disappears. A later stagecoach robbery produced another poem, but investigators concluded that the handwriting belonged to a copycat. Stories claimed Bowles had been hired by Wells Fargo, had returned to crime, had gone abroad, or had simply lived quietly under another name. None of those stories produced a final answer strong enough to close the case. Black Bart had spent years announcing himself with poetry. His last act was silence. Pearl Hart disappeared in a different way. She became famous because a woman robbing a stagecoach in 1899 was exactly the kind of story American newspapers wanted to turn into spectacle. Hart and a man known as Joe Boot held up a stagecoach outside Globe, Arizona territory. They were caught within days. Hart then escaped custody in Tucson, only to be recaptured in New Mexico. She was eventually sent to the Yuma Territorial Prison after a federal mail-related conviction. The prison made her even more famous. Reporters photographed her, interviewed her, and turned the so-called Lady Bandit into a national curiosity. In 1902, Governor Alexander Brody pardoned her. After that, the facts become much harder to separate from the stories. Some accounts placed her in show business. Others said she worked under an alias. A popular later claim identified her as a rancher's wife who lived quietly for decades. The Arizona historical sources preserve versions of that identification, but other historians have warned that the documentation is not strong enough to make every detail certain. What is certain is that the woman who had once filled newspapers largely disappeared from public view. Pearl Hart did not vanish in a cloud of gun smoke. She vanished into competing biographies. Hoodoo Brown had once used the law itself as camouflage. His real name was Hyman Neal, and in 1879, he became a powerful figure in the boomtown of Las Vegas, New Mexico territory. He served as justice of the peace and acting coroner, while surrounding himself with gunmen who became known as the Dodge City Gang. The group included men such as Mysterious Dave Mather, J.J. Webb, and Dirty Dave Rudabaugh. They were supposed to represent order. Instead, contemporary accusations and later histories tied the gang to robbery, corruption, violence, and the protection of its own members. Brown's official position gave him something most outlaws never possessed. He could influence the machinery that decided whether violence was treated as murder or justified force. That arrangement could not last forever. By 1880, opposition in Las Vegas had hardened, and warrants began to close in around the gang. Brown fled New Mexico. He was later arrested in Kansas, but released when authorities could not legally hold him. Then Hoodoo Brown dropped out of the reliable record. Later stories placed him in Mexico or connected him to a family life under another name. Those claims may contain pieces of the truth, but the disappearance itself remains the strongest documented fact. A man who had once controlled a courtroom ended with no courtroom able to explain what happened to him. Mysterious Dave Mather almost seemed designed for a story like this. He moved repeatedly between the worlds of lawman, gambler, saloon owner, gunfighter, and suspected criminal. In Dodge City, he served as an assistant marshal while also owning part of a saloon. His feud with rival saloon operator Thomas Nixon became deadly in 1884. After Nixon fired at Mather and wounded him slightly, Mather shot and killed Nixon 3 days later. He was cleared in the killing, but Mather's trouble did not end there. In 1885, he and his brother were accused in another killing in Dodge City. They were released on bond. Then Mather began moving away from the places where official records could still hold him. The last well-supported sightings place him in Kansas later that year. By 1887, his bondsmen were telling a court that Mather was dead. They could not produce a body. That missing body created exactly the space legend needed. One story sent him to Texas. Another sent him north into Canada. Another claimed he became connected with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Later researchers found no firm evidence for the more colorful versions. Mather's own brother reportedly said he simply did not know what became of him. For a man nicknamed Mysterious Dave while he was alive, the ending was almost too perfect. The nickname survived because the answer did not. Dan Bogan disappeared after the law had already decided exactly how his story was supposed to end. Bogan was a cowboy and gunfighter whose violence eventually brought him to Wyoming. In 1887, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. He was locked inside the Laramie County Jail in Cheyenne. Then someone smuggled saw blades into the jail. On October 4th, Bogan and other prisoners cut their way out and escaped through the building. Wyoming authorities launched a major manhunt and offered a large reward. The escape was serious enough to appear in official proclamations describing Bogan and the other fugitives. Lawmen searched the region, but Bogan kept moving. Private Detective Charlie Siringo later followed information that carried the hunt through the West. Accounts connected Bogan to Utah, New Mexico, New Orleans, and possibly South America. Then the trail broke apart into contradictions. One newspaper said he had been killed in Mexico. Another story said he died in a riding accident. Other accounts claimed he escaped to Argentina and prospered. Siringo later suggested that Bogan may have returned to the United States under another identity and lived quietly on a ranch. No version became definitive. The sentence of death had been clear. The death itself never was. But no disappearance from the Wild West grew larger than the one attached to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. By the end of the 1890s, the Wild Bunch had become one of the most hunted outlaw groups in the country. Railroad companies and Pinkerton detectives helped make staying in the United States increasingly dangerous. In 1901, Harry Longabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid, was photographed in New York with Etta Place. The photograph survived in Pinkerton records and later entered the Library of Congress collections. Soon afterward, Sundance, Place, and Butch Cassidy left for Argentina. For a time, they tried something that looked almost like retirement. They lived on a ranch in Patagonia and operated under assumed names. But pressure followed them south. Eventually, Cassidy and Sundance moved deeper into South America. By 1908, they were in Bolivia. Then came the event that was supposed to end both mysteries. After a payroll robbery in southern Bolivia, 2 English-speaking bandits were pursued to the town of San Vicente. Bolivian soldiers surrounded the building where the men were staying. Gunfire followed during the night. According to the prevailing account, one wounded bandit killed the other and then himself rather than be captured. The bodies were buried locally. The problem is that no identification available at the time conclusively proved that the 2 dead men were Cassidy and Sundance. That gap was small enough for history and large enough for legend. Later stories claimed Cassidy had returned to the United States. People said he had visited family, lived under another name, or survived for decades after Bolivia. Other claims tried to move Sundance into an equally secret second life. Researchers have investigated graves, family stories, photographs, and supposed sightings. None has produced a universally accepted alternative ending. The strongest historical case still points toward the 1908 Bolivia shootout, but the absence of conclusive identification prevents the story from becoming as clean as the death of Billy the Kid or Jesse James. Even Etta Place, who was not known to be an outlaw herself, eventually disappeared from the historical record and added another unanswered question to the Wild Bunch story. That is why Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid occupy a strange place between history and folklore. They probably died in Bolivia, but probably is exactly the word that keeps them alive. These disappearances do not all mean the same thing. Black Bart appears to have deliberately stepped away after prison. Pearl Hart slipped from public notoriety into disputed identities and uncertain later accounts. Hoodoo Brown escaped one collapsing criminal network and left behind little reliable evidence of what followed. Mysterious Dave Mather became a missing man before rumor converted him into half a dozen different men. Dan Bogan escaped a death sentence and then scattered his trail across competing stories. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid may have died together, yet the final proof never became strong enough to silence every survival claim. The Wild West is often remembered as a place where violent men died violently, and everyone knew who pulled the trigger. The record is messier than that. Sometimes the posse lost the trail. Sometimes a body could not be identified with certainty. Sometimes a famous name simply stopped appearing in reliable documents. And once the facts went quiet, legend became free to finish the story. Which of these vanished outlaws do you think has the most convincing final explanation?